Achtung, Achtung, or hey there, buddy. Welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk USA with me, Al Murray, James Holland, and John McManus. Let's get straight to it. Salerno, that's our subject today. James, you've been itching to talk about this with John, so I might sit back and go do my usual thing and gosh, how interesting. For the next 45 minutes.
Sounds like a good job.
It's a great job. I'm happy and it suits me down to the ground. I can do it, put it that way.
So Salerno is Operation Avalanche, and that's it's launched on the 9th of September 1943, and this is in a way 8th Army has crossed the Straits of Messina a week earlier. The announcement of Italy's surrender, armistice, has been made over the previous day. And the whole point is that this landing is much higher up the leg of Italy. So 8th Army has crossed the Straits of Messina. It's been in the tow. It's taken Taranto. Then 8th Army is sort of spreading northwards, to try and join up when the forces of the Anglo-American forces, although it's a US 5th Army, land at Salerno, but also just sort of sweep up from the south. And, anyone who's ever been to Italy will know that that's no easy task whatsoever. Because of the roads, because of the landscape, because of the mountains, all the rest of it, and the general lack of infrastructure compared to a lot of other places. But Salerno is just south of Naples, and if you look at the map, you kind of think that's the southern Italy, and it is, in terminology, it's southern Italy, but in terms of kind of the geography of it, it's about a third of the way up, and it's quite a long way, from the toe of Messina to, from Reggio, across the Straits of Messina, all the way up to Salerno, Naples. I mean, it's kind of 200 miles or something. I mean, it's like a seriously big journey, which I know is nothing, if you're driving across Kansas or Texas or something, but it is by European standards. That's and it is in terms of an army trying to join another army in very treacherous terrain. So suddenly Avalanche looks like a really, really big gamble. And the problem is shipping, because the demands on global shipping by this time are absolutely enormous. And you can see that the Allied High Command, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, have just got themselves in a bit of a bind because they've got these huge forces in the Mediterranean. They've just had this terrific victory in Sicily. Italy is out of the war. That's great. Fascism has been overthrown. Tick, tick, tick. But Overlord, the cross-channel invasion, is planned for May 1944. Obviously, as we know, it ends up being June, but it's planned at this point for May 1944. And there are lots of operations going on in the Pacific. 1943, as you will know more than anyone else, John, is a key year in the war in the Pacific. Yep. And what do you do? And it's not, you've got the Soviet Union going, we need your support, we need your help, we need you to also put your 2 penneth in, or your 2 cents worth, I should say, and contribute. But unlike this Red Army, organizing Allied armies in Western Europe is really difficult because it involves amphibious operations. And as soon as you involve amphibious operations, your complication factor is just sort of, times 100. Yeah. And it's the amount of shipping, it's the amount of supplies, because it's not just getting there, it's then sustaining it once you're there. And so on the one hand, you've got this incredible logic. And we can get into Italy, we can get the Foggia airfields, which is this one bit of sort of flat area in the sort of central southern part of Italy, and we can get strategic air forces in, and then we can continue to tighten the noose around Nazi Germany with strategic bombing from the south, and it's closer to Ploesti, which is the only oil source in Romania that the Germans have. You can draw off troops from the Western Front. You can draw off troops from the Eastern Front as well, just by being in Italy. All of these are really, really big ticks. So there's an obvious logic to it. You can see that. The problem is how you actually make it work, and make it work in an effective way,
and make it lead to something productive. It's the logical next step after Sicily. Why are you there if you're not going to go on to Italy? What's the point of all this?
This is the point. So there is this overwhelming momentum pushing the Allies into Italy. The problem is the moment you start talking about going into somewhere around Naples, either north of Naples or just south of Naples, which is where they end up going, in this Salerno area, just south of the Amalfi coastline, this little bulge that sticks out. You've got to find the shipping to do it properly. And the bottom line is, by the time they go on the 9th of September, having vowed never to have any reversals and having vowed to kind of, really have overwhelming before they do anything to minimize the risk, they're mounting an operation which looks suicidally, craven. I mean, it is so fraught with risk And everyone always looks at it as, God, they got there and they nearly got put back by the Germans and they nearly got hammered, and everyone was surprised when the Germans turned up. My reading of all this that I've been doing over the last few weeks and months is that there was no surprise whatsoever. No. They knew what Germans were there. They knew the potential threat. They knew there were hills there with guns in them. They knew that they were undercooked, and they knew that it was a massive, colossal gamble. And the amazing thing is they still did it. And that is because the political forces at play were so great that they couldn't back down. And that was overwhelmingly stronger than the potential threat of failure, I think. That's my reading of it.
I think so too. Yeah, because Italy had to mean something.
Well, exactly. And you can't remove political impetus from discussions of strategy. Because if war is politics by another means, then strategy is politics by another means, isn't it? The idea that there are two distinct arenas, I think is is unrealistic, isn't it? That's why Rome is so important. That's why you take Rome. Capital cities matter. It's why the Russians tried to take Kyiv, at the start of the war in Ukraine, because you decapitate the state, you completely changed the political landscape, which is, after all, what you're fighting over in the first place. I mean, the thing is you're absolutely right though. Once you've done Sicily, what you've got to go to Italy, haven't you? And once you've gone to Italy, you want to hurry that up because it's bloody difficult. And
yes, but you've got these huge forces in the Mediterranean, and if you're an outsider looking in, you're going, well, we got all these forces in the Mediterranean, we might as well use them. We got to use them. We got to do something meaningful. We got to get, if we're going to go, we need to get the two big cities of the southern half of Italy, Rome and Naples, and we need to get them in quick order. And if we get Naples quickly, then we got a big port, which then means we can set up in Foggia really quickly. What we can't afford is to go up from the boot and slog our way up the mountains and only get kind of, an inch up the boot, which is why they start thinking about terms of Operation Avalanche, because this is a means of negating that, and you're already got a big chunk of Italy just by landing in Salerno.
Well, it almost reminds me of what we nowadays call mission creep.
Yes.
That you get involved in something and then it just sort of metastasizes into something bigger. So in a way, it's what the Americans had worried about in getting involved in the Mediterranean theater in the first place, with North Africa and then with Sicily, that it would lead to what the Americans thought of as, putting resources into tertiary operations. Yeah. And so Italy has to mean more than just the Foggia airfields. It has to mean a backdoor way into Germany, into the Balkans, into Austria.
Right.
And, but once you've taken Sicily, it really doesn't make much sense not to go to the Italian boot. But then what does that really mean? And that's why Salerno is so problematic.
And the reason they go to Salerno, so the beaches north of Naples are much better from a landing point of view because it's flat around there. It's not there's not mountains overlooking the invasion site. The problem is it's just too far for fighters. They'd be there for 2 minutes and they'd have to come back again. Yep. Whereas at Salerno, they've got kind of 20 minutes, half an hour there over the beachhead, flying from northern Sicily and southern Italy, very, very, very southern Italy, but mostly coming from Sicily and from northern Sicily, from the Catania Plain and all around there. That's where they're flying from, and it's a long way. It's a good stretch up there, and that's the constraint on it. And consequently, they've got these fantastic beaches, which are brilliant landing beaches. The flip side is you've got all these hills built inland. I mean, literally 10 miles inland. 5 miles inland, there are all these hills in which if you're Germans, you can put your guns in there, you can have OPs, observation posts, and all the rest of it, and see everything that the Allies are doing.
But Jim, by way of comparison, how long do fighters have over Sicily in the invasion of Sicily during the
Well, much much more because Malta is only 60 miles away, and from Cap Bon is they've got a decent amount.
Exactly. So their experience is we need good and plenty fighter cover. And we don't want to stint on the fighter cover.
Yeah.
So that's what's informing this decision. Is that worked before? That's what we're going to do again.
But it's one of those things. It's one of those things that you.
I know. Of course,
it's totally non-negotiable.
Exactly, but it's their operating method. Is you have the fighter cover. So that's what you set yourself up for. Which is
but even Hitler in 1940 understands that. I mean, that's why it's such a basic tenet of sort of bottom line of amphibious warfare that you would have to have air control over the landing area. And if you don't, you're not going to do it. So that's why that's so important. But the constraint is these hills overlooking the Salerno invasion. I mean, immediately inland, it's pretty flat. But it's very quickly the hills. I'm saying 10 miles. It's not even 10 miles. What am I thinking? It's like 3 or 4. I mean, it's nothing. It's easy within range of observers. It's easy range of long-term, long-range artillery.
Hemmed in, basically. Yeah. I mean, well, actually, that's Salerno's the best you can do. I mean, in terms of going as far north as you can with some semblance of an acceptable landing area, but with all its warts. But you actually see this whole dynamic play out during the whole Giant 2 fiasco, which was the abortive airborne drop on Rome that the Italians wanted before all this, that almost gets the 82nd Airborne destroyed before, Maxwell Taylor and another guy go in there to deal with the Italians secretly and send the message back. We cannot drop an airborne division on Rome. It'll be completely annihilated. So you're seeing right then all the warts that Italy features, that you can't advance very far north, for reasons even beyond air cover. And then, Jim, as you mentioned, the shipping takes us to another level of complexity too. So, this invasion is sort of, it's what you can do rather than what you should do.
And we should also say that Fifth Army has been building since Casablanca Conference, really. That's when it's created, and Clark is put in charge. He's been obviously Eisenhower's number 2 for Operation Torch, the invasion of Northwest Africa, and he's a very good planner and administrator, and he's chomping at the bit to be given a kind of field command. And frankly, he's earned that post. He's ambitious, and he's been chivying Eisenhower for that post. But it's a perfectly reasonable appointment. I think there's no question why he shouldn't. But the bottom line is it means that he's in charge of Fifth Army. And he's got no combat command experience whatsoever at that level. He has, in terms of organizing and being an administrator and a planner, absolutely, and he's ticked all those boxes. But actually, on the ground, no. So that's fresh, and he's only got 3 divisions that he can land. So he's got 2 British divisions, and he's got 2 American divisions, the 36th Texans and the 45th Thunderbirds. But the Thunderbirds are in reserve, and the reason they're in reserve is because there's not enough shipping to get them all to the beach.
Exactly.
So when I was there, and I was messaging Al while I was there, going, bloody hell, this is a hell of a long way. The difference, from Paestum, which is where the 36th Texans land, to the southernmost British landing, which is actually then abandoned. I think it's Green Beach. That's 15 miles, and it's another
river.
It's another
and
couple,
a river separates you.
And a big river in between the two.
The Sealy River, yeah.
The Sealy River. So
exactly.
What's the thinking there? Because I'm struggling to find they debate over where they're going to land, and they go, and we decided this, but they don't say why we decided this.
I've wondered the same thing.
Is it congestion getting ships in and out, and that you need the beaches are well defined and tidy for that reason?
No, it cannot be. It cannot be. There's a road that runs parallel to the sea, and it's dead straight, and there's nothing on it. And in that time, there was no buildings on it whatsoever. There is no cover whatsoever, apart from a few kind of, umbrella pines here and there, and the odd kind of, building and villa or whatever. But there's literally nothing, and there's a Sealy River that divides the two halves. Otherwise, there's Salerno. But there's absolutely no issue that you could land 3 divisions on the Salerno front. Because Paestum's not in Salerno.
Right, and I've wondered the same thing, and I'm not saying this from an evidentiary viewpoint, but an opinion viewpoint. I've always thought they wanted a presence on both sides of the river, and they wanted the 36th Division to be in the position to link up with 8th Army coming up from that side. I'm not saying it made sense, but it seems like that's the only way you could sort of view this as the right thing to do.
So people either side of the river makes it easier to control the river, basically. It's sort of
right. If you control both sides of the river, the problem, of course, is what happens is that the river bisects you and disperses your strength.
Yeah.
At the very moment where you need maximum strength.
Yeah,
now,
exactly.
If it's obvious that this is what the Allies can do, so that rather than what they should do, is it obvious to the Germans that this is what's going to happen next? That
they're going to invade at Salerno?
Yeah.
It is. It's the obvious place in some respects, but it's the most defensible place.
Yeah.
Like Jim was saying, in terms of the high ground.
They've got the 116th Panzer there, and
yeah, or 16th, I think.
The 16th Panzer. Yeah. Sorry, that's up in Holland, isn't it?
Did the Allies arrive with a thunderclap of surprise, or are they, did the Germans know exactly what's going to happen? Because if it's obvious, the obvious place to land, then it's the obvious place to defend, and as Jim said, it's defensible.
Yeah, it's absolutely defensible. And the Germans sort of know what's about to happen. And there's this big argument between Clark and Admiral Kent Hewitt, the naval commander. Hewitt's like, yeah, they're going to know we're coming by the time we're here because our ships are moving through the Mediterranean. They've got aerial reconnaissance. There's a lot of ways they're going to divine this, in addition to knowing the obvious place to land. So we're really better off bombarding these targets before you go in.
Yeah.
The ground troops were hoping to have the complete surprise, and it was a dark, nighttime invasion. I think 3 or 4 in the morning, something like that. So the hope was to achieve that kind of coup de main surprise, but this isn't what happened. And so I think they probably would have been better off bombarding those targets beforehand.
Tip them off, won't you, if you shell them?
Yeah, I mean, if you can get surprised, that's great. And if you can really keep them off balance and get surprised, well, then, of course, it makes great sense. But Hewitt makes, I think, really the salient point. This isn't going to happen. They're going to know we're on our way and probably to here. So I think when you balance that, it's better off to eliminate some of these targets that are going to cause you some serious problems from that high ground.
Yeah.
This is what Hewitt was arguing, I guess.
Yeah. And I suppose there's some legacy of that in the Overlord plan, that they bomb everything. They bomb absolutely everything they possibly can bomb and run a big deception thing, even though there's obviously only 2 places you could possibly do it. I mean, as deception misdirection goes, Overlord is sort of fantastically successful because that's it's heads or tails, isn't it, really, invading France from the British Isles?
And it's a compromise. You've had all those airstrikes, and then you're going to have about a 45-minute naval bombardment. So it's sort of like we sort of have surprise in terms of time and place, but we're not going to have such a protracted bombardment that we yield that kind of shock of the invasion.
Yeah, yeah. Is that a thing that Clark then ruse later on, or does he regret his decision to try and do it without a bombardment, or is Clark a man for regrets?
It doesn't strike me as a man for deep regrets, but I think he's a man of intelligence, and I think he probably realizes that it would have been better to bombard those targets. I would suspect that he wished that a lot of them were not there by the time things proceed as they do, because you have about 5-6 days of some pretty serious crisis in terms of the German counteroffensive.
Well, one of these days we should have a big discussion about Mark Clark generally, but what I would say is I think he does make mistakes along the way, but I think he learns pretty quickly. And I think it's there's no general that doesn't, senior high commander who doesn't make mistakes. The question is do you improve and do you learn from those and do you progress? And I think he does. I would also say that his handling of the situation once they're committed is quite impressive, really. Getting on the beaches and showing a real presence and courage and helping handle anti-tank gun units and all this kind of stuff. I mean, I think that shows resolve and commitment and courage and all those sort of things.
There's never any shortage of courage with him.
And the truth is, he's been dealt a really, really tough hand. For all those who are involved on that landing, that is an absolute bitch of a task, because the odds just don't favor you. We've talked before about Sicily, about how Montgomery particularly insists that you're eliminating the risk, and I'm a big fan of that strategy. I think that seems incredibly sensible, because you never want to be fighting over the same place twice. You never want to lose lots of blood pointlessly. And if you've got the resources and you have the capacity to make sure that your amphibious landing is achieved with as little risk as possible, you absolutely should take it, because that's the most dangerous bit. Everyone knows that the Allies have got overwhelming material advantage. It's just how quickly can you bring that to bear? That's the million-dollar question of Normandy.
Absolutely.
But those conditions are just not in place in Avalanche. So although it looks like the Allies are continuing their advance, albeit at a slightly slow rate, there's a kind of inevitability about it. I would say that Operation Avalanche is a moment of deep drama and one of incredible risk, which is out of all character of the Allies at that stage. It is,
and Clark later on says, the whole invasion plan, the forces he had, it was nothing even like what he felt he ought to have had going in there. And he'll later say, but if he'll basically imply, if I wouldn't have done it, they would have gotten someone else who did. And he thought, all right, I'm going to make the best of this. Quite revealingly, too, General Kenneth Strong, who's Eisenhower's very effective intel officer by now, he will later, make the opinion that this is the closest we ever came to an actual bona fide tactical defeat on the ground under Eisenhower's command.
Yeah.
And I think that's definitely, that's it right there. Because that 5-day period, maybe even 6, I don't think there's too many other times like that from 1942 on for the Western Allies that you can point to a kind of larger strategic defeat eventuating from a tactical reversal. The other thing that blows my mind about Salerno, guys, is just how ignorant the soldiers were of the geopolitical situation.
It's incredible.
They're aboard ship, and they hear that Italy has surrendered, Eisenhower's announcement, and they all rejoice like this is the end of the war or something. And I'm like, guys, you came to Europe to fight the Germans primarily. Don't you think they're going to be there? I mean, it was the worst news you could get, actually. It really was. And they're acting like it's VE Day. It's just bizarre to me.
But John, because the whole Italian campaign is so tainted, and because of what follows, whether it be the bloody Rapido or whatever, it's always seen as, I still feel it's sort of seen as a bit of a black mark against Clark. Whereas actually, I would say the fact that he pulls it off, okay, it doesn't matter that, and everyone sort of goes, I mean, I read something yesterday or 2 days ago where it said, had it not been for the Navy and the Air Forces, they would have probably lost. And you sort of go, that's such a crass statement, because the Allies are this tri-service operator. That's how they work. They are the complete package. How else are they going to do it?
Well, how else do you do an amphibious landing? I mean,
right. You got your shipping.
Exactly. So I would have said a much better phrase was, despite not having overwhelming material advantage, they won the day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
would be a better way of saying it. And I would say that's no small achievement. And as the man who's in charge on the ground, I think Clark deserves a bit more credit for it, to be honest.
Well, let's hold that thought. We'll take a break and we'll return while you're all reeling from James sticking his neck out for Mark Clark. We'll see you in a second. Welcome back to We Have Ways to Make You Talk USA, where James Holland has left Second World War history enthusiasts stunned and incredulous that he should stand up for the vain, over-egged Mark Clark. I mean,
it's his man crush on Mark Clark, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I think that's what we're getting right here. It's only to be rivaled by his man crush on Harold Alexander. But
no, that's on a different plane. That's on a different plane. Trust me.
The thing is, if you are going to look at this the other way round, the fact that a general with no combat experience, who's an organising guy, a staff officer essentially, the fact that he's able to pull this off surely says something about the quality of the people leading the American army, training their officers, gluing the whole thing together. Not only have they got the right people in the right jobs, but the mechanism for getting them there is pretty reliable. And after all, Eisenhower is similarly qualified in combat experience, and he's making the big calls at the top. Surely we have to sort of place credit where it's due that someone like Clark, with his talent and his ability, can be discovered and then teed up to get the job right. I mean, how has that come about? Why is Mark Clark the right person, the right place?
Well, because you've had guys like him who are solid professionals. In his case, of course, West Point trained, and most of them were, who have had enough of a commitment to that idea of soldiering and national service that they have hung in there through a long interwar period when there weren't a lot of opportunities, but there were enough that they could have a career, that they could be learning at the Command and General Staff College, at the Army War College, with also sometimes embedded with foreign armies or as military attaches or learning staff work or being mentored. There was a kind of mentoring tradition that you saw in the Army. People like Fox Connor were mentoring the Eisenhowers of the world. And, so this starts to pay off by the time of World War II, when you have these very kind of ambitious, upwardly mobile, and kind of hitting their sweet spot at middle age professionals like Clark, like Kent Hewitt on the Navy side, who's also, I think, a fine commander on a lot of levels. Like Eisenhower, like Bradley, like Ridgway. There's just a lot of these folks who now have their kind of shining moment. So I do think that speaks well, and I also think that there's an established tradition now of inter-service coordination, much less inter-allied, which adds a completely new component to it. That's working reasonably well. Hewitt and Clark work together reasonably well, is I guess what I would say.
And what's the sort of intellectual temperature in the American Army for officers? Because the British Army has these sort of all these competing things of, there is a staff college and there are people that teach it and there are people who take soldiering seriously, but they're kind of in the minority, and it's non-you to talk shop and all that sort of stuff. And also the British Army has devolved to its imperial role. It's not thinking about fighting European wars between the wars. If it could possibly help thinking about it, it would rather not. And it looks at things like, there are armored warfare enthusiasts, but it tends to see that as the past, part of a disastrous, bloody past that no one wants to go back to for all sorts of entirely sensible reasons. What's the intellectual tradition Mark Clark's coming through?
Well, I mean, by now you've got all these established schools, the Army War College, the Naval War College, the National War College, the Command and General Staff College. There was a lot of places where you could get this kind of postgraduate schooling. I think there was a great deal of respect for that because competition was very keen for slots in those billets, where you were going to be trained for modern warfare. There is, I think, a respect within the armed forces for people who have dedicated themselves to really preparing for the future and thinking about the future in a kind of relentlessly American way. I think that's a big part of this too. And they've had to suffer some of the slings and arrows in larger popular culture, in which, especially in the 20s, the view of the people in the armed forces is not very positive on the part of most Americans. And so the peer pressure you would get on what we must say is sort of the elite side of this equation, officers in the Navy or the Army, the peer pressure you'd get is, hey, why aren't you out making money, as a lawyer or something, or on Wall Street or running a business? Why are you doing this? And it probably from your in-laws, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But John, you think about someone like Monty or Alexander or any of these guys, they're all brigadiers, major generals by the kind of middle of the 1930s. Mark Clark's still a captain at the start of 1940.
Yeah, right.
And he's been a captain since 1919.
Isn't that wild?
So he spent 14 years as a captain. He's a captain until 1933. He's then a major, just a major from 1933 until July 1940.
Yeah,
and then he becomes a half colonel. He jumps one straight to brigadier general in August 1942. And by this stage, by November 1942, so a year after that, just a little year after he becomes a brigadier, 1-star, he's a 3-star. Compared to your British allies, if you're an American senior commander, you've spent an awful lot of time. And it's the same for Eisenhower, and it's the same for Bradley and all these guys. Yeah. They've been majors and, at best a half colonel throughout most of the 1930s.
Eisenhower's a major under MacArthur for years in the Philippines. I mean,
right. Yeah. And then suddenly you're doing these huge leaps of rank, and suddenly from having absolutely nothing and being a kind of a comparative nothing in a comparatively nothing army, you're now a lieutenant general in charge of millions, or a 1 million strong army, or a 500,000 strong army, or something like that. It's these guys have to learn super quick, and in a way, the kind of the long gestation period has helped a lot of them. Because, as you're saying, John, they've had this opportunity to be nurtured and tutored and observe and learn. And the guys who are good are really, really good. But you've suddenly got to kind of compress an awful lot into a very, very short period of time. Clark's advantage is that he's had this incredible lead-in with the planning of the development of the army, working under McNair and people like this in the kind of, early stages of the pre-war and first part of the war, then having this dream ticket of going with Eisenhower to Britain and helping set up the US forces there and Bolero and all the rest of it. Then, massive brownie points with Torch, which he is largely responsible for planning and which goes off pretty well. And in which he shows kind of, fearlessness and courage by going in and talking to Darlan beforehand and all the rest of it, and the submarine
story.
and all
really
and all that. So he's ticking all the boxes as he goes up. But the fact remains, at the moment of Salerno, suddenly he's in charge of still pretty big forces and plenty of forces behind him, waiting to, for the shipping to allow them to kind of come into play in this major high risk operation, and he's got to deliver. And he probably makes the wrong call on the bombardment, but he makes most of the right calls thereafter, I would say.
Well, he manages the crisis pretty well. And he
manages the crisis
pretty
well.
And I think in terms of the criticism of Clark, I think one of the places it comes from is he's held responsible in some respects for the weakness of his corps commanders. Dawley, during Salerno, and later on Lucas during Anzio, kind of a throw him under the bus kind of sense. Whether that's fair or not, I'm not saying, but so.
But what do you make of those two? Because they do seem a bit ineffectual. Lucas seems like a good staff man, a good chief of staff kind of.
He's
figure,
more. This is the interesting. Dawley is out of his depth.
You think he's good?
Dawley is out of his depth. Clearly, to me, at Salerno, I don't think there's any question. This is a cavalryman who's not really adapted to modern war. Lucas, on the other hand, is a DSC recipient who has proven his courage in combat repeatedly, who is thoughtful and is deliberate. But the problem for him is he's not aggressive enough for what Anzio would call for later. If you're landing at Anzio, why are you just landing to sit around? Why not grab the high ground? We just talked about Salerno's high ground, how important that is. Why aren't you on the Alban Hills? Why aren't you doing at least something? And Lucas just isn't the guy. So if you were to put Truscott there, we all think probably it's going to play out differently from that standpoint. So I think Lucas is a different animal than Dawley, but I think that Clark is saddled with a guy in Dawley who's just not really up to snuff for this thing.
But again, this is all because they haven't been tested yet. I mean, they might have been tested in kind of some form a long time ago in the First World War. But, Dawley, you don't know. It's a bit like Friedendahl in Tunisia. It turns out that he's absolutely hopeless and completely useless. But, there aren't quite this. Well, there are some signs, actually. But until you're tested, you don't know. Right. Bradley comes out trumps. Patton, you start to see, what he can deliver. It is a leap of faith to a certain extent. I mean, again, you're trying to kind of, there's a lot about Clark to like in the run up to Salerno that makes you think, well, if you're a betting man, you reckon the chances are he's going to be okay compared to others, but you don't know.
They've also they've been in Ireland, they've been in India, they've been in Palestine. They've been doing Iraq.
They've been retreating in 1940.
They've been retreating in 1940 and in 1941 and in 1942. They've had plenty to be getting on with. So I mean, the fact that the American army, which is the sort of think tank blank slate, that it should produce people who are brilliant is incredible. Of course, any army will produce people who it turns out in the clinch can't cope or can't deliver. And, because after all, that's the final test, isn't it? It is when you're actually having to make those decisions in the moment. And what the enemy's doing as well can very much disrupt your expectations.
Well, that's true at the soldier level, too.
Yeah, completely. It's a universal.
Yeah, it's going into its first combat and sort of learning along the way. Now, this is going to be a really hard luck division on some levels throughout the war, and so you're seeing the sort of harbinger for that right at the beginning. The division is just spread out all over. I mean, only 2 regiments are landing initially, which is already kind of difficult. Then the other one is separated from the other 2, and so you're in a manage the crisis kind of situation almost from the beginning. The 36th Division soldiers get a very tough grind,
and then what ensues over the next 6 months, 5-6 months, is just
more
absolutely
of the same.
Staggering.
It is.
It is staggering how they are able to kind of replicate themselves over and over and over again, despite gargantuan losses.
Yeah, it's incredible,
and despite having the heart of their division kind of ripped out, their rifle regiments. It's just
horrible.
It's just astonishing. And the reason they're constantly flung into it is because, there's a shortage, there's not enough. And this is the problem with Italy all the way through. On paper, they've got to a point where the Allies can force multiply by weight of material rather than manpower. But that's negated in Italy to a large extent, or certainly in the winter of 1943, beginning of 1944. And so the huge amount of extra pressure is put on these rifle companies and these rifle regiments and battalions to do the hard yards. And just a huge amount is being expected of them. And it's the same problem at every step of the way with the Italian campaign. There's never quite enough to do what they need to do. And it's a bit like your 6-month thing, Al. Al's got this theory that the Allies always got us 6 months ahead of where they want to be because there's new technologies coming up, and in 6 months' time it'll be brilliant, but they need to do it 6 months earlier, and so they haven't quite got enough.
We've got to do it now. We can't do it.
Got to do it now
when the thing's finally ready. Yeah,
that's absolutely the case with the Italian campaign. There's just not quite enough, and on paper it looks great, but the harsh reality of the front line, the sharp end, is a very different one.
Yeah, and when you're talking about that level of terrain, that amount of high ground, the lousy infrastructure in southern Italy, and you're facing an army that is just crackerjack in terms of defensive doctrine, booby traps, mines. The geopolitical situation is an absolute and total mess. It's a civil war now that's going on in Italy, for sure. I mean, if the war was bad for Italy from 1940 to 42, you ain't seen nothing yet. It's about to get way worse. And so I think the Allies would have done well to study Napoleon's campaigns in Italy and Hannibal's campaigns along a lot of that same terrain. Granted, it's different eras, but just to see the kind of headaches they're dealing with. And again, granted, they're not always coming in from the same direction, but a lot of the same things apply. So Italy was just always going to be a very tough animal. And unless you had the will to prioritize it, which of course wasn't going to happen, you were going to end up with this 6-month thing. And you were always going to have enough, but not what you really needed in order to produce serious results.
And then when the moment comes for Dragoon, you're stripped further back, aren't you? So you don't get over that's Alex's lament, is you don't get over the Po when you want to threaten southern Germany within 1944. You don't do it until the following year because France has been prioritised, and that's the most graphic moment where the Italian front fits into the Allied strategic picture, when Dragoon goes ahead. And obviously they make great leaps and bounds, and that operation in itself is a great success, sort of pushing into the vacuum of southern France.
Well, it's also an insight into the power play, the power dynamics by then. In 1942 and 43, the British get much, maybe we'd even say most of what they want in relation to operations in that part of the globe. By 1944, I mean, obviously Churchill, as we all know, is a bitter opponent of Dragoon. I mean, he's trying to destroy it until the last minute. No, he doesn't get it because the Americans want Dragoon. And that could actually be another whole show that we do, because I think that's fascinating too, because I mean, what our various viewpoints is on that, and the whole Dragoon thing. But
well, we should definitely talk about Dragoon.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. Everything leads to something else to talk about.
And we haven't really talked about the German response at Salerno either. That's a whole podcast on itself.
Oh yeah.
We've got that going, haven't we, Jim?
Well, I think there's nice seeds for something more about Salerno in a few episodes' time, and then seamlessly moving on to Dragoon. And we can also talk about the fall of Rome and the post-war, the Trasimeno line, and the whole arguments about Dragoon.
You know what else is fascinating too? The socio-cultural side of it from the U.S. Army perspective, of how Italy's complete degradation now, and also the social discourse part of this. I mean, the venereal disease rates, the corruption, all of this kind of stuff that's happening now, especially along that West Coast as you get up and beyond Naples, is an amazing story.
Vito Genovese turning up.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Well,
there's plenty to chew on.
Lots to chew on for another time. Thanks everybody for listening. Thanks from me and John and Jim, and we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.
Cheerio.
Take care.